Hello! Today I'm following on from my recent Ifrit episode and looking at its consistent counterpart and foil in the Final Fantasy games, the summon known as Shiva. Now, Shiva's an interesting one because, like Ifrit, it has appeared in most entries of the series, and unlike, for example, the Thunder Summon Ramuh, who has been sporadically replaced by Ixion or Quetzalcoatl in a few games, Shiva is a relative staple and has become synonymous with the summonable ice element in the minds of most players. So today I want to delve into the origins of Shiva as a real-world cultural entity and look at how faithfully or not that has been transcribed and utilised in the pantheon of Final Fantasy summons in these games. And in something of a departure from Ifrit, who in my previous episode we found to be generally quite faithful to its origins in mythology, Shiva appears to amalgamate quite a few mythological references, be it aesthetically, etymologically, and elementally. And jumping right in on that note, Shiva, by naming convention, refers to one of the three primary Hindu deities, known as Shiva the Transformer or Shiva the Destroyer, who along with Brahma the Creator and Vishnu the Preserver, is a supreme being in the cyclical samsara creation stories of the Hindu Vedas. Now, there's a lot of symbolism and attributions that are bound up with Hindu gods. They each represent certain things and are closely bound to designated items, animals, and even spouses that reflect aspects of their character or events that have transpired. And the reason I raise this is that of all of the wide-ranging things that Lord Shiva represents to people and presides over, the element of ice, or indeed any element, is not one of them. So it's fair to suggest that beyond the name, the Shiva of Final Fantasy is very much its own thing. And while I have seen some suggest that, aside from being the opposite sex, there is a physical similarity, because Lord Shiva is often depicted as blue or ashen white, this is because Shiva presides over death and rebirth, and so his proximity to cremation pyres leaves him white with ash, and also in one tale he consumes poison, which turns him a bluish hue. So once more, this is not attributable or relatable to the element of ice in any real discernible way. And I think it's fair to say that the Shiva of Final Fantasy is pretty much entirely divorced from this Indian source material. And on the note of the name, just as an aside, one of my friends suggested years ago that maybe Shiva is just a lazy adaptation of the word Shiva, as in to be cold. And I thought that was quite funny because with all of the mythological references and cultural allegories that are kind of stuffed into Final Fantasy and are frequently unpicked and researched by people like me and fans of the games, it did make me wonder if we were simply not seeing the forest through the trees with how simple this name is, and maybe it was just that reference to the sensory word of being cold. But moving on, I want to stress that despite being Shiva in name only, that's not to suggest that Final Fantasy Shiva is simply conjured from the creative minds at Squaresoft. And indeed, if we return to Western folklore, particularly Norse, Germanic and Greek creation stories, there's some very clear parallels that can be drawn here, specifically with lesser beings such as nymphs, who are spirits that personify aspects of nature such as forests and water. And in Greek mythology we have classifications of nymph such as Dryads, who inhabit trees, Naiads, who inhabit water, and similarly in Germanic lore we have Nixies, who inhabit the sea, and sylphs and fairies, who represent the air. So what's particular about these examples is that they are overwhelmingly female, and they are very particular representations of a specific element or natural formation. And looking at Final Fantasy Shiva, we can observe that she is in keeping with the femininity and quite elvish or fairy-like representation that these beings often have. And for example, in most Shiva designs that I can think of, she has pointed elven ears and quite a willowy elemental physique, such as we see in fairy tales and Renaissance paintings of nymphs and these sorts of creatures. And indeed, just thinking about Shiva in Final Fantasy XIII, where she has the twin sisters Styria, which is a root word of icicle in Latin, and Nyx, which, as mentioned previously, is a water nymph in Norse and German fairy tales, we can see that beyond the Hindu naming convention, Shiva is quite heavily rooted in form and function to pagan stories and Western folklore. And just thinking about other such Western fairy tales and folklore, we have stories like Hans Christian Andersen's Snow Queen, which is a prime example of a female embroiled with the element of ice, and may well lend to Shiva's common description as an ice queen in several places. Turning to design and inclusion, much like Ifrit, Shiva debuted early in the series and has proved a relative consistency by way of appearance ever since she appeared in Final Fantasy III. However, unlike Ifrit, who periodically appears in more combative and temperamental capacities, such as we discussed his appearance in Final Fantasy VIII, and again in Final Fantasy XV, where he's a bit of a disruptor, Shiva, by comparison, often appears much milder in temperament and more amicable with party members, insofar as her personality is explored in these games, and once again, Final Fantasy XV is a great example of that. In terms of design, I don't think it's much to labour on, but again, it's a relative constant with Shiva appearing in a bluish hue and quite sparsely clad, which I put down again to references of nymphs and things like that, but more specifically the artistic representations of nymphs and these creatures, looking back through history, and everything from Greek sculpture to Renaissance art, like Botticelli's Birth of Venus, we can see that an absence of clothing among the supernatural, and particularly among supernatural females, is something that has persisted all throughout history when looking at these fictions. So that about wraps up my brief summary of Shiva and the amalgam of influences that she has from culture, religion and history. And I thought it was worth delving into some of these bits that have been questioned in the past by players around her name and stuff like that. And as mentioned in my previous episode, I do really like Shiva and how she forms this opposing elemental, but also characteristic and personality to her longtime counterpart of Ifrit throughout the games. So if you got this far, thanks very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I'll be doing some more summon summaries in the coming weeks and months, so do consider subscribing or check back in future for some more of these origin stories.